this tutorial, we're going to be creating a 3D model in Maya, applying the textures, and doing the texture baking so that we bring it into Unity and we have just a single FBX file for the model and a single texture for both all of the textures and lighting. The shadows that you see here are baked with Turtle and Maya, and the directional light here, of course, is not making any of those shadows. This object is using an onlit shader. So we're going to be creating the 3D model, applying the texture, and doing the texture baking. Stay tuned. We're going to get started right now. Okay, so here we are in Maya LT 2017 on a brand new scene, and I'm going to go to Window, Workspace, and reset to the factory default. That way I'm starting exactly how Maya normally does. And I want to take the window outliner and dock it right here. The other thing we need to do is make sure that the Turtle plugin is loaded. So we could go to Settings, Preferences, Plugin Manager, and scroll towards the bottom where it says Turtle and Loaded and Auto Load. So now that we have Turtle loaded and we also have the outliner, let's get started. You're going to create some 3D model, or maybe you're just import a 3D model. So I'm going to create something basic. You'll of course have something a lot more complex. I just want something basic that gets the point across. But one feature is multiple materials. So the model you import or the model you're creating, chances are it's going to use multiple textures on it, and so that's what I want to set up in this example. So I've got 3 objects here, and I want to put a different texture. I have some textures right here. I want to put a different texture onto each one. So I'm going to go to Window and Material Texture Baking Editor and select Hypershade. I could also get that by clicking this button right here. And in Hypershade, I'm going to go to Create Materials and create a Phong material. And I'll name this material, we'll call it Stone. So the stone, under the color, I'm going to select the button right here and select File. And we'll click on the Folder button. I'm going to paste the path into my textures, and I'm going to select one of these stone textures, and then double clicking the material here. I want the transparency, ambient color, incandescence all the way down. Diffuse by default is 0.8. If you wanted it to be a little brighter, you could drag that up to 1. And I want the specular all the way down, the reflected color all the way down. And I've turned off refraction, so this will be just like a flat diffuse, like a Lambert. Now I'm gonna go ahead and select this material and Control D to duplicate. This one I'll call Wood, and again select the color, File, and I'm just going to select one of the wood textures here, and then one more time duplicate the wood, and I'm going to call this one Metal. And of course, for the file, I'm just going to select a metal texture. So I have 3 textures, 3 materials here, and I'm going to select the cube and right-click Assign Material to Selection. Same thing with the cone and the sphere. So we have 3 objects with 3 different materials and textures on them, and these also have their own individual UV map. We could see the sphere mapped here, and I didn't want to dock it, but we could see the sphere mapped here. We could see the cone, how it's mapped here, and we could see the cube, how it's mapped here. Now if we want to do, we're doing our own 3D modeling, of course we would select select some of this and do some UV mapping. But the point of it is that there's 3 different objects here, and they all have their own UV maps set up, and 3 different textures. We're going to bake this all down to 1 texture. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and select the 3 objects and go to Mesh, Combine. And we have the history saved. We could save that if we want, but I'm going to delete all by type history so that we have just a single object. I'm going to call this my object. And this represents the 3D model that you're working with, whether you're creating your own 3D model or importing it into Maya to do some texture baking onto it. So I have a single mesh, and we're ready to do some baking. So we could go to Window and Material Texture Baking, say Texture Bake Settings. And under the settings, I'm going to have it set to Preview right now. And I want to see what the bake looks like, so I'm going to go to Window and select Texture Bake View. Now, a faster way to get to these windows is going to be going to our shading here and also our shading tab. And I can select this button for the Texture Bake View, and I can select this button for the Texture Bake Settings. So I have it set to Preview, and that means it's going to go ahead and, when I do a bake, it's going to just do a preview to this window. So I can rotate the camera around the model, look at it from different angles, make sure the texture is lit how I would like it. Now here there's no lights, so that's not going to turn out too well. We can select from a bunch of different lights here: ambient light, directional light, point light, spotlight, area light. And of course, those all work to make your lighting in your scene or on your object look really nice. So here I have a light set up. We could go back to our render view and take a look at how our texture is going to end up looking. Now that is not going to turn out well. There's at least not enough of those. So you might duplicate that light, or you might use different types of lights in combination together to get the lighting on your object looking pretty good. So here, zoom in a little bit so we could see what's going on. And we're going to render it and go around the object, get the lighting set up, use different types of lights perhaps. Directional light would be used like for a sun. So if this is an exterior scene and we're baking some sunlight, of course you might want to use a point light in your scene. And what I am doing here is I'm surrounding my 3D model with lights so that every side of it except maybe the bottom is getting some light onto it. We have maybe I'll bring an ambient light in as well, just to show an example of using different lights. And the end goal is to get a nice looking render here. And one thing I definitely want to set, if I go to my texture bake settings by selecting this button, and it's down here, I want to make sure under global illumination that I enabled global illumination, and primary GI should be set to final gather. So now let's take a look at the render. There's a nice shadow coming from the sphere onto the cube. Then the rest of it though is probably going to be pretty well lit up, probably even too bright. So I either need to reduce the amount of lights in the scene or get these things a little further away just because it was looking a little bit too bright. So even the bottom of the model is completely lit up. I think that's coming from the ambient light, so I'm going to go ahead and take that out, re-render, and there it is. If I look at the bottom, it's probably going to be dark again. So I'm going to just get the lighting set up in the scene here. So some of the values that you might use, modify to make it look better, is the intensity of the light. I'm going to change the example. For example, the point light to a 0.1. You also might want to change the color of the light to to a different color. And now, of course, the bottom of where I'm working at here is going to be a lot not so bright. And same thing goes for these area lights. What I have here is I have a directional light coming in from one side, and then on the other three sides I have an area light. And those area lights are pretty bright on the side of the model here. So I can either lower the intensity. There it is. Yeah, just looking too bright. So a couple ways to change that would be to either change the intensity, color. I can also change the scale of those area lights, and they're gonna be not nearly as bright, of course, because the light source is a lot smaller. So changing the scale down on those, I'll go ahead and take another look here, and that looks a lot better. It's just not as overpowering with the amount of light on the texture bake. Okay, so looking around the model, I'm happy with the lighting now, and I'm happy with this is how my texture is going to look. So now I'm ready to do the texture bake. I'm going to open up my texture bake settings again, and I'm going to change this to the bake. We can change the anti-aliasing settings here, global illumination, the final gather, the environment settings. There's options, and what I'm really interested in for this tutorial is the baking tab. Under texture bake settings, we're going to find the width height for the map. We're going to do 1024 by 1024, merge to one map. And this is the path where the texture is going to go into. And with that, I'm ready to do a bake. And I can see it's gone back to the preview, which is because I've selected this button that I've been using. So with 1024 set and my path, I'm going to go ahead and select this button right here, which is bake with the turtle. So we could see it says not doing anything. And the reason why is because there is nothing in the bake set. There is a default turtle bake layer here, but there's nothing that's been assigned to that. One way to fix that quickly would be to say bake selected surfaces. So if I've selected my object and I have bake selected surfaces, I should be able to select the button here, and it's going to bake what I have selected. Now, what we're going to have here is a problem, as you can see. It's baked everything onto a single texture. So what we can do to fix this is we're going to have to create a new UV map, since this is 3 separate UV maps. Now the way we're going to do this is go back to the modeling. So with my object selected, I'm going to go to UV and go to the automatic, but I'm going to select the box so I have options. And under the options, I'm going to create a new UV set. Now if I go to my UV set editor, I can see I already have a map But I want to create a new UV set, and I'm going to call that one UV set 2. We're going to hit a project, and that puts me into component mode. So I'm going to go back to object mode. So now we have 2 UV sets. Here's the new one, which is UV set 2, which contains a cube, the sphere, and the cone. And if I go to map 1, we could see that we have the original UV map for the 3 objects. So the textures still look the same, but we have a second UV set that we're going to do the baking to. And it has all 3 objects mapped onto the one texture. So back under my texture bake settings, which is down here, I'm going to go ahead and scroll down, make sure I'm on the baking tab. And if I go to texture bake settings, it has a UV set. So I'm going to put in the name of the second UV set. So if I select my object, I could see it's UV set 2. So lowercase UV, capital S. So I want to bake the texture to UV set 2. Alright, so I have that set. We have it set to bake. And here's the texture bake view, and I'm going to select this button, which is the turtle bake. Okay, now this looks better because we have the texture for the object, for the cube, texture for the cone, and the texture for the sphere all put onto one texture map. And I can see that it also has the lighting baked in. Now it's put into this directory, which is at my project root. So here is my project folder. I'm going to go to this location. And then I just have to go to the, you can see that if my project is, the current project is default. So that's this folder, and then I have to go to /turtle /bake textures. And here's my TGA file. So I'm going to open this with Photoshop, and it should be a 1024 by 1024 texture, single texture for my one mesh. I want to take a look at that in Unity, but if I want to see what that looks like here inside of Maya, I'm going to need to go to the Hyper Shade again, and we'll need to make a new material and assign our file, texture file, to this material. So here's my TGA file. And on this material, we of course, the transparency is set to from the file. I don't necessarily want to use the transparency. So what I can do is right click on the word transparency and say break connection. So now it's not using the transparency. I could adjust the diffuse. It's by default it's 0.8. But I want to assign this material to my object. So I'm going to right click assign material to selection. And we can see it doesn't look correct. So if I select my object and to go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, no, the relationship editor to UV linking, because it's still using the default, the first UV set. So we're going to go to either texture centric or UV centric. And on my object, I want to change it to the UV set 2. To use that file. So now it's using the that second UV set, which is of course where all 3 textures are combined. When I export this model to Unity, I want it to only have one default UV set, not the 2 of them. So I'm going to go back to the UV editor. And in the UV editor on my object, this of course is the UV set that I want to use, UV set 2, and map 1 was my original, and that could just be deleted now since we're done with the texture bake. So I cannot delete the default UV set. You can notice if I say delete current UV set, it's going to not let me. But what I can do is go to UV set 2 and say copy UV set to map 1. So copy UVs to UV set map 1. And now I should have map 1 and map 2 are the same exact. So now I can select map 2 and say delete current UV set. And we should only have one UV set now, map 1. Another way to see that should be UV set editor. And I can see that map 1 is my only UV set. Now back onto my object. The relationship editor UV linking doesn't matter because there's only one UV map to work with. So now I don't need the lights anymore. I could save this file. I probably want to save my source file. Save my source. Oh my goodness, save my source scenes so that I have my source file. But really, we don't need these lights. And we're done with our bake layer as well. But we can select our mesh and say export selection. And so I'm going to save this as my object, and that's an FBX port. So now I'm going to open up Unity. Okay, and here I am in Unity. Here's a random scene from my last tutorial, which was about sphere casting, but we're not worried about that. You can watch that video if you want. What we want to do is find our FBX file, which I've saved to my scenes folder, and I want to drag that FBX file into Unity. The other file that we need to import into Unity, of course, is that texture file that I decided to bake to a TGA, so I'm going to import that TGA. Now that I've imported my FBX, which is this one, I don't need any animation for this. It does not have a rig. The model could use the scale factor, I believe. We'll drag it into the scene to see. It's too small. So what I could do is not use file scale and hit apply. There we go, that's better. We'll get these out of the way for now. Here's my FBX model. And here's my texture. I can drag my texture onto it, and that's going to create a default material, or the material, we can see there's two of them have already been created. And that's not too great. So I'm going to select my object and say import materials no. Turn that off. And I'm going to delete this whole material folder. And now it's missing a material, so we're going to say create a material. And say my object material. We will assign this to the cube. So now if I select this, I could see the material. I'm going to want to assign a shader to this. Now if we use the standard shader, that'll work. We could drag this onto the albedo map. It just looks funny because it's shiny, because the lighting here is shining off of it. And to make it look exactly like it did in Maya, we want to use an unlit shader, so I'm going to change that to unlit texture. So now it has the exact flat diffuse texture how it did over here in Maya when we originally baked the texture. So now I have my 3D model here in Unity, and I have my texture applied to it. It's been baked down into, from my 3 different textures, it's been baked down into one texture, of course. And my FBX is imported into Unity. My textures here, everything is working great. This would work for props or environments or whatever you want to do. So that's kind of why I picked these random shapes, because it could be a prop, it could be an environment. It just depends what you design here in Maya and how you set up the lighting. So I hope this tutorial was helpful. If it was, give it a like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the